The Galactic Empire's heart beat loud and clear within the Grand Palace, a structure that towered above the rest of the galaxy, its shining spires a testament to its power. But within its cold, steel walls, something sinister was brewing. The king, ruler of this vast empire, sat in his high throne, his fingers drumming on the armrest. His face, usually calm and commanding, now bore a look of annoyance as he stared at the holographic image before him. A diplomat from Earth was arriving soon, a simple messenger carrying nothing more than a request for peace. The king saw Earth as weak, a primitive little planet in the far corner of the galaxy. He had no respect for their ways or their leaders, believing them to be nothing more than ants beneath his feet. Yet this diplomat, a woman named Lyra, was said to be special. Her presence in the Empire's court had caused a stir, though the king couldn't understand why. Earth's message was clear. They wanted peace. They wanted safety. But what the king wanted was something much different. He wanted control, power, and he would stop at nothing to keep it. Peace. He muttered to himself, his voice filled with disgust. A foolish request. Earth has no idea who they're dealing with. His cold eyes glinted with malice. Let's see how long she lasts in my court. Unbeknownst to the king, Lyra was far more than a mere diplomat. She was much more than just a messenger sent to deliver a request for peace. She was a force, a living legend who carried the weight of unimaginable power. Yet the king didn't know this, and that was his first mistake. As Lyra made her way through the palace halls, she could feel the eyes of the guards on her. She moved with purpose, her posture straight, and her gaze unwavering. Her purpose here was not to fight, not to spill blood, but the galaxy had a way of pulling its inhabitants into war, whether they wished for it or not. Her sharp eyes scanned the architecture around her, noting every hidden passage and every security measure as she walked. This was not her first diplomatic mission, nor would it be her last. But today, she would encounter a man who would change everything. At the heart of the palace, the king's grand throne room awaited her. The enormous doors opened with a dramatic hiss, revealing the vast hall inside. The king sat atop a high-tech throne, surrounded by his advisors, soldiers, and servants. He was a man of grandiose presence, wrapped in gold and draped in the symbols of power. He looked down at Lyra as she entered, his gaze filled with arrogance and superiority. "Welcome, diplomat," the king's voice echoed, his tone thick with condescension. "I trust your journey was comfortable." Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded, maintaining her composure. "I came to deliver Earth's message of peace, Your Majesty." The king's laughter filled the room, a harsh, mocking sound that made Lyra's skin crawl. "Peace? How quaint. You think you can come here, to the center of my empire, and ask for peace?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Do you truly believe your people are worthy of it?" Lyra's gaze never wavered. "I believe in the possibility of peace, just as I believe your people have the capacity for it." The king's eyes glinted with malice. "You don't understand, do you?" He rose slowly from his throne, his movements deliberate and predatory. "You are nothing but a tiny speck in the grand universe, Earth, a backwater planet barely known beyond its system. You have no real power. You can't stop what's coming." Lyra stood still, her breath calm but steady. "I do understand, Your Majesty," she said softly, her words carrying a weight that seemed to hang in the air. "But you don't understand me." The king's expression twisted into something darker, his features contorting in disbelief. He had seen many diplomats, many petitioners come to his throne, pleading for peace, offering alliances, and all of them had been easily dismissed. But something about this woman, something about Lyra was different. His gut twisted with unease, and that unease grew when she stepped forward, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "You really believe you can control everything, don't you?" Lyra's voice broke the tension, each word dripping with authority. "But you've forgotten one thing. The galaxy is not yours to control. It never has been." The king's face reddened with fury. He gestured toward his guards, signaling them to surround her. "Enough of this insolence," he shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. "This woman dares to lecture me." The guards moved quickly, closing in around Lyra. But before they could lay a hand on her, she spoke again, her voice colder now, tinged with something far more menacing. "You've made a grave mistake, king. A mistake that will cost you everything." The king paused. His guards hesitated, sensing the sudden shift in the air. Lyra's calm demeanor was unsettling. It was as if she was a storm contained within a fragile shell. The king, however, was too proud to recognize this. He was too powerful, too self-assured. He saw no reason to worry about a single diplomat. He turned away from her, smiling to himself. "Take her away," he commanded. "She will be dealt with." But Lyra's eyes never left him. She could feel the power building within her, ready to unleash. The king had made the worst mistake of all. He had underestimated her. And now, as the guards approached her, she took a single step forward. "You don't even know what you're dealing with, do you?" she whispered to herself, barely audible. The room grew still, and for the briefest of moments, the entire palace seemed to tremble. Lyra wasn't just a diplomat. She wasn't just the Earth's messenger. No, she was something far more dangerous, someone who had survived and thrived in places no ordinary person would dare to venture. Someone who had seen death and chaos, and emerged stronger. And the king, in all his arrogance, had no idea what was coming for him. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to feel in the air, like static before a storm. Lyra's eyes never left the king as he turned away from her, dismissing her as nothing more than an annoyance, a mere fly buzzing around his empire. The guards moved closer, but Lyra remained still, every muscle in her body coiled, waiting. She was not afraid. She had faced far worse than this, and she had learned to harness fear, turning it into strength. The king's voice rang out again, his command sharp and final. "Take her away," he ordered, his tone dripping with the confidence of someone who thought himself invincible. But as the guards advanced, Lyra's hands tightened at her sides. Without any warning, her body moved faster than anyone in the room could react. One guard reached for her arm, but she twisted his wrist with the force of a seasoned warrior, throwing him into another guard, both of them crashing to the ground in a heap of tangled limbs. The king's eyes widened in disbelief as Lyra's speed and strength became painfully clear. The remaining guards hesitated, unsure of what to do next. They had never encountered anyone like her before. "You think you can control me?" Lyra's voice cut through the thick silence, her words cold as ice. "You think I'm just another diplomat you can dismiss?" Her calm demeanor was now gone, replaced by a fierce energy that seemed to radiate from every pore of her being. She was not just a woman from Earth, not some weak negotiator. She was something far older, far more dangerous. The king recoiled, finally beginning to realize the mistake he had made. His mind raced, trying to grasp the gravity of the situation. There had been whispers about Earth's diplomats, rumors about their abilities, but none of them had ever posed a real threat. Yet here she stood before him, her gaze burning with the fire of someone who had seen death, who had fought and survived against the most impossible odds. "Guards!" the king shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and fury. "Don't let her leave. Surround her now." His command sent the remaining guards into a frenzied motion. They rushed forward, weapons drawn, intent on capturing Lyra. But Lyra was already 2 steps ahead. She moved with a fluidity that seemed almost unnatural, her every movement precise and deadly. She ducked under one guard's weapon, kicking him in the chest, with the force of a lightning strike, sending him sprawling to the ground. Another guard swung a stun baton at her, but she sidestepped and used his own momentum to send him crashing into a nearby pillar. It was clear now. The king's men were no match for her. They were strong, but she was faster. They had numbers, but she had skill. And above all, they had no idea who they were really up against. The king's face turned a dark shade of red as he realized he was losing control. He had never anticipated this kind of resistance. He had expected a diplomat who would be easy to intimidate, someone who would bow to his will, but Lyra was not that person. Enough, he bellowed, rising from his throne, his hand slamming down on the armrests in a futile attempt to regain some semblance of authority. I will not be made a fool of in my own palace. Lyra turned her gaze toward him, her eyes cold and unyielding. You've already made a fool of yourself, Your Majesty. She spoke without a hint of fear, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. You thought I was just another weak diplomat. You thought your guards could overpower me. She took a step toward him, her movements graceful and calculated. But I am not like the others. You've underestimated me. The king's eyes narrowed, rage and disbelief mixing in a storm behind them. You think you can defeat me. You think you can defeat my empire. You are nothing. A mere insect caught in the web of a greater power. Lyra smirked, taking another step forward. I'm not an insect, Your Majesty. And this empire, she gestured around her, to the palace, to the wealth and power that surrounded them both. This empire will fall, just like the ones before it. It's built on fear and control, but that only lasts so long. The king's face twisted in anger, his words thick with venom. You think you can challenge me and survive. You are in my palace now. This is my domain. Lyra shook her head, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. Not anymore. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but the finality in her words cut through the air like a knife. You made the mistake of underestimating me, and now you will pay the price. Before the king could respond, Lyra's eyes flicked to the guards who had remained standing, still unsure of how to proceed. They were beginning to realize that their king, the mighty ruler of the galaxy, was not the one in control here anymore. Lyra's power was undeniable, and they could see it, feel it in the air, a tension that hummed like the electric crackle before a storm. The king's voice was almost pleading now. Stop. This madness needs to end. His words were strained, desperate. I can make a deal with you. Whatever you want, just name it. Lyra's expression softened for a moment, but only just. It's too late for deals, she said quietly. Your reign is already over. The galaxy is changing, and you're no longer part of it. The king's face turned pale, realizing that his empire, his power, was crumbling before his eyes. He had spent years building this legacy, crushing his enemies, and yet here was this woman, this diplomat, who had brought it all to the brink of destruction in just a matter of hours. As the guards hesitated, unsure whether to attack or stand down, Lyra turned away from the king, her focus shifting to the larger picture. She had come here not to negotiate, not to seek peace, but to end a reign of terror that had lasted far too long. The king was nothing more than a symbol of that empire now, a symbol that was about to fall. But Lyra wasn't done, not by a long shot. She had only just begun to unravel the power of the galaxy's most feared ruler. The king, his mind reeling with panic, watched helplessly as Lyra turned her back on him, her attention focused on the broken empire he had worked so hard to build. His throat tightened with anger and fear. The realization had finally set in. He had underestimated her, and it was going to cost him everything. Stop right there. The king's voice cracked as he struggled to maintain whatever shred of authority he had left. You think you can just walk away from me. You think you can take what's mine without consequences. His hands gripped the armrests of his throne, knuckles white. Lyra didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Her words were calm, but they carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what was happening. It's already too late for consequences. Your Majesty, she said softly, her voice full of an eerie calmness. You made your move, and now it's time to face the cost. The king's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, but now, as the events unfolded before him, He realized that he was nothing more than a man standing in the way of something far greater than himself. The Diplomat. No, the Baba Yaga was standing in front of him, the woman who would bring his empire to its knees. For the first time in years, the king felt fear creeping into his chest. He was the ruler of the galaxy. He was supposed to be the one who controlled everything, not the one who was controlled. His gaze flicked over to the guards, still stunned and unsure of their next move. They were too afraid to act, too afraid to face Lyra's terrifying power. He had underestimated them too. These weren't just ordinary guards. They were soldiers who had trained for years, but none of them could stand up to what Lyra truly was. "Do you know who I am?" The king's voice wavered with an unspoken plea. Lyra turned back toward him, her face expressionless, her eyes like twin icebergs. "I know exactly who you are. You're a king who believed his power was invincible. You're a man who thought he could kill me with a simple trap, not knowing that I've walked through death itself and come out the other side stronger. You are just another tyrant who has built his empire on fear and lies, and now your time has come to an end." The words struck him like a physical blow. The king staggered back as if he had been slapped, his mind racing, struggling to process what she was saying. He had heard the rumors, the legends of Baba Yaga, but he never thought they were true. He had assumed it was all myth, a story to scare children. But now, standing before him, was the living embodiment of that legend, a woman who had the power to end everything with a single thought. "I gave you a chance," Lyra continued, stepping closer, her voice growing colder. "I gave you a chance to make peace, but you chose to attack. You chose to underestimate me. And now you'll pay the price." The king's mouth went dry. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He opened his mouth again, but it was as if his voice had been stolen. He was the mighty ruler of a vast empire, and yet in this moment, he was nothing. He was powerless. He had no army, no control, no leverage. It was all slipping through his fingers like sand. In a desperate attempt to reclaim some form of control, the king's hand flew to his communicator, hidden beneath the sleeve of his royal cloak. His fingers fumbled for the button. Calling all units, he barked into the device, his voice frantic. "Activate the palace defenses. Lock down all exits." But as he spoke, nothing happened. No alarms blared. No lights flashed. No forces arrived. It was as if the very palace itself had turned against him. Lyra, sensing his growing panic, smiled coldly. "I disabled your security systems the moment I entered. Your precious guards can't help you now." She stepped even closer, and the space between them seemed to shrink, as if the very air was growing thicker. The king's face paled as he realized that he had no way out. He was trapped in his own palace with the one person who could undo everything he had worked for. "I have nothing left," the king muttered, his voice barely audible, his bravado slipping away. He lowered his head, realizing the depth of his situation. "Please, don't kill me," he begged. "I beg you." Lyra's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I'm not here to kill you," she said. "I'm here to teach you a lesson." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "The lesson is simple. Power built on fear is never lasting. It crumbles when the truth is revealed, and the truth is that you are not the master of this galaxy. You're a puppet, and I'm the one who cuts the strings." Her words were like a cold wind, biting through the king's defenses, stripping away the last remnants of his delusions. The once mighty ruler sank back into his throne, his shoulders slumping in defeat. There was no more fight left in him. His empire, his throne, everything he had worked so hard to maintain, was slipping away, and he couldn't stop it. Lyra didn't need to say anything more. The truth was clear. The king had built an empire on lies, and now he was going to watch it all come crumbling down. The time for peace had passed, and now there was only one thing left for him to witness: the fall of his reign. Outside, the stars continued to shine, indifferent to the events unfolding within the palace walls. The galaxy was moving on, and the king's empire was fading into the history books. Just another fallen kingdom, another forgotten tyrant. Lyra turned and walked away, her purpose fulfilled. The king could do nothing but watch, powerless to stop her. He had learned, far too late, that there were forces in the universe far greater than his power, forces that could not be controlled, and certainly not destroyed. And as Lyra disappeared into the shadows, the king was left to face the ruin he had created. The galaxy had changed, and he was no longer part of its future. The king's throne room had fallen silent. The once gilded walls now seemed to close in around him, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on his chest like a physical force. His heart raced, still pounding from the encounter, but it wasn't fear for his life that gnawed at him. It was the overwhelming realization that everything he had worked for was gone. His empire, his glory, all of it was slipping through his fingers. Lyra had walked away, leaving him in his palace, alone with his thoughts. The guards, who had once been so certain of their victory, stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They had witnessed the power of the woman who was now known as Baba Yaga. They had seen her tear through their ranks effortlessly, and they could no longer pretend that she was just another diplomat. The king's mind raced, trying to grasp at some last thread of control, but there was nothing left. He had failed. The old alliances, the deals made in shadowy corridors, the power he had accumulated, all of it was meaningless now. His hands trembled as he gripped the armrests of his throne. His empire had been built on fear, and that fear had failed him. One of the guards, still trying to come to terms with what had happened, stepped forward cautiously. "Your Majesty, what do we do now?" he asked, his voice a whisper. The king's eyes flared with a mixture of frustration and shame. "We fight," he rasped. "We gather the forces and strike back. We will not let one woman bring down everything I have built. This empire, this is mine." His voice cracked with desperation, but he couldn't bring himself to hide the panic that twisted inside him. But deep down, the king knew it was hopeless. Lyra's power had shattered everything he thought he knew about control. His mind kept returning to the way she had moved, swift, graceful, and lethal. Her eyes had been cold, unyielding, as if she knew exactly what she was doing, as if she had seen kings and empires rise and fall countless times. He had underestimated her, yes, but more than that, he had underestimated the very nature of the galaxy itself. Outside, the stars continued to burn, indifferent to the king's plight. The galaxy was vast and filled with forces he could not comprehend. Lyra, with her ancient power, was only one example of the untapped depths of strength that lay in the universe. His empire had been founded on domination, on the idea that he could control everything, everyone. But now he was beginning to realize that he had never truly controlled anything. The palace, once a symbol of his unmatched power, now felt like a cage. The corridors, the grand halls, the thrones, they were all just reminders of his impending downfall. The king's empire was built on fear, yes, but fear was a fragile thing. It could be broken with a single act of defiance, and Lyra had proven that in a way no one had ever done before. Still, his desire to hold on to what was his pushed him forward. He called upon his commanders, his closest advisors, the generals who had helped him keep his empire intact for so long. One by one, they entered the throne room, their faces marked by concern, but their loyalty still intact. They too had seen Lyra's power, but they were trained to fight and to win. "Your Majesty," one of the generals said, bowing low before the king. "What are your orders?" The king didn't answer immediately. He looked around at the men and women who had sworn to protect him, who had helped build his empire. They were his last remaining hope, and yet a part of him felt that their loyalty, too, was starting to slip away. His empire was a house of cards, built on the loyalty of those who feared him. But fear was not loyalty, not real loyalty. Finally, he spoke. "We need to act quickly. Prepare the fleet. Send word to every corner of the galaxy. I want every ship, every soldier ready. We will find her. We will strike before she can make her move against us. We will remind them that I am the ruler here, not some Earth diplomat or mythical creature." The generals nodded and moved to carry out his orders, but they did so with the unease of those who knew they were following a sinking ship. They had seen the power Lyra wielded, and it had left them uncertain of the outcome. The king's orders would be followed, but the question on everyone's mind was whether it would even matter. Meanwhile, Lyra was far from concerned with the king's desperate rallying. She had already set her plans in motion, and the truth of the matter was clear. The king's empire was weak, and it was only a matter of time before the cracks began to show. He had spent his life building his kingdom on fear and manipulation, but Lyra knew something he didn't. His empire was already crumbling from within. She had already reached out to her allies, those who had long since turned their backs on the king's regime. There were many in the galaxy who had been oppressed under his rule, many who had waited for a sign, for the right moment to rise up against the tyranny. Lyra's actions had sparked a fire that would soon spread across the stars. The king was not just fighting her now. He was fighting an entire galaxy of people who were ready for change. And change was coming. Back in the palace, the king was beginning to see that his previous approach had been foolish. His anger was no longer directed at Lyra alone. It was now directed at the very structure of his empire, the fragile system of control he had once believed would last forever. The truth was dawning on him. He was not the master of the galaxy. He was simply a man with a throne, and the throne was slowly slipping away. The palace doors swung open once more. A messenger entered, bowing low before the king. "Your Majesty, the fleet is prepared. But there is something else." "What is it?" The king barked, his patience thinning. "The rebellion. It has already begun." The messenger replied, his voice quivering. "The people have started to rise. Lyra's actions have sparked a wave of uprisings. We are no longer just facing her. The galaxy is turning against us." The king's face went pale. His empire was crumbling faster than he could imagine. His hands trembled as he gripped the armrests of his throne once more. He had made a fatal mistake, a mistake that would cost him not only his crown but his very existence. The king's empire, once a shining beacon of power across the galaxy, was now on the verge of collapse. His palace, the seat of his vast dominion, felt eerily quiet as the whispers of rebellion began to spread like wildfire. Lyra's actions had ignited a spark in the galaxy's oppressed citizens, and now that spark was consuming everything in its path. The king's gaze wandered across the throne room, his eyes lingering on the grandeur he had so carefully constructed. The golden pillars that had once gleamed with pride now seemed tarnished. The soft fabric of his royal banners faded in the dim light. His empire, his very identity, was beginning to crumble before his eyes, and the weight of his impending downfall was too much to bear. The panic he had tried to suppress now surged through him in waves, and the hollow echo of his once commanding presence was all that remained. He stood up, his legs shaky, his mind racing. How did this happen? He whispered to himself, though he knew the answer. He had overestimated his own invincibility. He had believed that no one could challenge him, that his power was unassailable. But now, in the face of Lyra and the rebellion she had sparked, he saw the truth. His empire had been built on fear, and fear was fragile. It was a foundation that couldn't hold up against the forces of change. The palace doors opened again, and the generals entered, their faces grim. The tension in the air was thick, and no one needed to speak to know that things were dire. The fleet was prepared, but the king's confidence in his forces was long gone. He had lost the support of his people, and even the might of his military seemed inadequate against the uprising that was rapidly spreading across the galaxy. One of the generals, his expression betraying his concern, stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the rebellion is growing stronger. Systems are falling into chaos. The people, They are no longer afraid. The king's breath caught in his throat. The words stung him as he realized that the rebellion had taken root far deeper than he had imagined. Lyra's influence was everywhere now, and the galaxy that had once bowed to his rule was beginning to fight back. I won't let them take everything I've built," the king growled, though his voice was shaky, lacking the power it once had. He clenched his fists, but his body trembled in fear. He couldn't afford to show weakness now. He wouldn't let them see how desperate he was. "Prepare the fleet," he ordered, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "We'll fight back. We'll make an example of them. Show them what happens when they defy their king." But deep down, the king knew it was too late. His empire was already lost. The people had spoken. Lyra's rebellion wasn't just a revolt. It was the beginning of a new era, one in which rulers like him would no longer be able to dictate the fate of the galaxy. As the generals left to carry out his orders, the king sat back down, his hands trembling. The walls of the throne room seemed to close in around him, the weight of his failure suffocating him. He had once ruled with an iron fist, using fear to control the galaxy, but now fear was his enemy. It was what had made him vulnerable in the first place, and now it was what was tearing him apart. Suddenly, the palace alarms blared, a harsh, shrill sound that shattered the tense silence in the room. The king's heart raced as he stood up, his eyes darting to the security monitors. Something was happening, something he couldn't ignore. A fleet of ships appeared on the horizon, moving fast, their sleek forms gliding through the void like a swarm of deadly insects. The king's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the insignia on the lead ship. Lyra's insignia. She had come. "We're under attack," one of the guards shouted as panic spread through the ranks. The king's mind raced, his thoughts spinning. He had to act quickly, but he knew there was no real strategy that could stop what was coming. Outside, Lyra's fleet moved in, efficient and unstoppable. Her forces had the advantage now. Her ships outnumbered his, and they were coordinated in a way his fleet could never hope to match. The rebellion had taken flight, and now it was descending upon him with the fury of a storm. The king's mind snapped back to reality. This was it. His empire was about to fall, and he could do nothing to stop it. The sense of power he had once held was gone, replaced by a cold, crushing weight of inevitability. As Lyra's fleet closed in on the palace, the king's gaze turned toward the window, where he could see the first of the enemy ships coming into view. He had tried to control everything, tried to bend the galaxy to his will. But now it was clear that the galaxy had its own way of balancing the scales. Lyra had shown him that, and now she would be the one to finish what she had started. The king's heart sank as he realized that no amount of strength, no amount of fury, could change what was coming. The rebellion would not be stopped. His empire would crumble, and his reign would be nothing more than a footnote in history, a tyrant brought down by his own arrogance. As the first blast of energy struck the palace, the king's thoughts drifted back to Lyra, the woman who had been underestimated, who had turned the tide of a galaxy. She was not just a diplomat. She was the Baba Yaga. And now, her wrath would reshape everything. The king had underestimated her, and in doing so, had sealed his fate. The galaxy was moving on without him, and the stars would continue to burn, indifferent to the fall of a king who had once thought himself untouchable. The final chapters of his story were being written, and Lyra, with her unstoppable force, was the one holding the pen. As the palace walls trembled under the barrage of attacks, the king finally realized there was no escape. His reign was over. The galaxy had spoken.